Welcome in, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at a pivotal moment in British history, the one that really set the stage for a lot of changes over the course of the next century, the 1832 Reform Act. Have you ever heard the phrase, reform that you may conserve?
I have.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like a paradox, right? But it's kind of like if you have a house with a leaky roof, if you just ignore the problem, the house isn't going to get any better. It's just going to get worse.
Right.
So sometimes you need to make changes to preserve what's really essential. And that was the issue facing Britain in the early 1800s. And that's what we're going to be unpacking today.
Okay.
And we have this fascinating mix of sources for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We have some parliamentary records that give us a glimpse into some of the really fiery debates of the time. We have some historical analyses that give us different interpretations of the Act's impact. And we even have a lesson plan from the UK National Archives that shows how this event is still shaping our understanding of British history.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
What's interesting, I think, is how that idea of reform to conserve
Yeah.
really captures the anxieties and the aspirations of a period that was on the brink of transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Britain was grappling with the Industrial Revolution. They had a rapidly growing population, and they were facing increasing demands for political participation, so the old system was really creaking under the strain.
Yeah.
The 1832 Reform Act was an attempt to respond to those pressures, not through revolution, but through calculated reform.
Yeah, so like almost a controlled burn.
Yeah, you could think about it that way.
Make sure the whole forest doesn't catch fire.
Exactly.
Interesting. So let's actually paint a picture of pre-1832 Britain.
Yeah.
What was the political landscape like back then?
Sure.
And what were the major issues that fueled this huge demand for change?
So imagine a system where your right to vote depended on whether you owned a significant amount of land.
Oh, wow.
That was the reality for most Britons before 1832. The vast majority of the population, including this new burgeoning working class in these industrial towns, they had absolutely no say in how their country was run.
So essentially it was like this system that was just shutting out a huge chunk in the population.
Exactly. And to add insult to injury, you had these things called rotten boroughs.
Rotten borough.
Rotten boroughs. These were electoral districts that had tiny populations.
Oh, wow.
Sometimes just a handful of voters, but they still got to send members to parliament. So you had these places like Old Sarum had only 7 voters,
Wow.
but they had the same representation as a bustling town with thousands of residents.
That's insane.
It's hard to believe now, but that was the reality.
Talk about an imbalance of power.
Oh, yeah.
That stuff like this is really ripe for an overhaul.
Absolutely. And you also had, on the other side of that, you had these rapidly growing industrial centers like South Shields in County Durham, which were teeming with people, but they had virtually no voice in Parliament.
Wow.
This lack of representation created this sense of deep frustration, and it really fueled the calls for reform.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you have this system that's favoring this landed elite and totally ignoring these changing demographics of the country. And that's where the 1832 Reform Act comes in.
Right.
It wasn't a complete revolution, but it did introduce some pretty significant changes.
It did.
So what are some of the key provisions of this act?
Well, the act sought to address some of these really glaring inequalities.
Okay.
It broadened the franchise by extending voting rights to men who rented property above a certain value,
Uh-huh.
which was a crucial step because it really empowered a new segment of society,
Right.
the middle class,
Right.
whose influence was growing right alongside the Industrial Revolution.
So it's almost like it's shifting this balance of power at least a little bit.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not just the aristocracy calling all the shots.
Precisely.
Other people get to weigh in now.
And the act also tackled those infamous rotten boroughs, abolishing many of them and redistributing parliamentary seats to better reflect population density, which meant that growing urban centers finally got a voice in Parliament,
Right.
which
Yeah.
was a major victory for those who had been clamoring for more equitable representation.
So it sounds like we're really seeing this attempt to modernize the system and make it more responsive to these changing realities of British society.
Yeah.
But was everybody on board? Was everybody happy with these changes? Or were there aspects of the act that were really controversial?
Well, that's where things get interesting because while the 1832 Reform Act was undoubtedly a step towards a more inclusive system,
Yeah.
it was also a product of its time, and that meant it carried certain limitations.
Right.
Perhaps the most glaring omission was the continued exclusion of women from voting,
Oh, wow.
which was actually a step backwards in some ways because there had actually been instances of women having voting rights in Britain before 1832.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
So the act effectively shut the door on women's suffrage for decades to come.
Yeah. So almost like one step forward, two steps back kind of
In
thing.
some ways.
So we have this reform, and it was really aimed at preventing a potential revolution.
Right.
It's trying to modernize the system, but not completely dismantle it.
Yeah.
So who are some of these key figures who are really pushing for this? Who are these voices that were really championing this change, and what were their motivations for doing so?
Well, one of the most prominent voices advocating for the act was Thomas Babington Macaulay, who was a celebrated historian
Okay.
and Whig politician.
Okay.
And his speeches and writings offer a fascinating window into the political climate of the era.
Yeah.
Macaulay argued very passionately that the Reform Act was absolutely essential to prevent Britain from following the path of France, which had experienced a very bloody revolution just a few decades earlier.
Right.
And he believed that by addressing these very legitimate grievances of the people, by making the system more representative and more responsive, that they could avoid a similar fate in Britain.
So they had this real fear of revolution that was almost like bubbling under the surface.
Absolutely.
Almost like he's saying, like, let's make these concessions now so that we don't have this huge, much larger upheaval later on.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about altruism or a sense of fairness. The Whig Party, which was in power at the time, saw the Reform Act as a way to kind of bolster their own political standing.
Right.
They hoped that by expanding the franchise and addressing some of the most egregious inequalities in the system, they could garner more support from those newly enfranchised voters.
So there's all this interplay of motivations going on. It's about preventing revolution, but it's also about political maneuvering and consolidating power.
It's complex, yeah.
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, this act was a compromise.
Uh-huh.
It was trying to satisfy the people who wanted change, but it also wanted to preserve the essential structure of British society. But was it enough? Was this reform to conserve strategy actually successful? That's something we're going to continue to delve into as we go through our deep dive today. We've been talking about how this 1832 Reform Act was this kind of strategic response to this growing pressure for change in Britain.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to see how the government at the time was trying to, like, walk this fine line between maintaining stability
Right.
and making these concessions to people who increasingly wanted a voice.
It's a tough balancing act.
Yeah. So let's go a little deeper into the arguments for and against this act.
Okay.
What were some of the anxieties, some of the aspirations that really shaped this huge turning point in British history?
Well, the specter of revolution, particularly the French Revolution, loomed very large in the minds of British politicians.
I bet.
They had witnessed firsthand the chaos and bloodshed that can erupt when a government fails to address the grievances of its people. The French Revolution really served as the stark warning, a reminder of what could happen if they clung too tightly to this old order.
So it's not just about fairness, it's also about making sure society doesn't completely melt down.
Precisely. And this fear was really amplified by the rapid transformations that were brought about by the Industrial Revolution. Britain was urbanizing at an unprecedented rate.
Right.
A new working class was emerging, and with it came new demands for social and political reforms. The old system, which was designed for a largely agrarian society, was struggling to keep up with these changes.
Yeah, you have all these moving parts, right? You have society that's changing so rapidly.
Right.
You have the government that's trying to maintain control.
Yeah.
And then you have more and more people who are frustrated because they feel left out.
Absolutely. And it's really important to remember that the arguments in favor of reform weren't simply just about preventing revolution.
Okay.
There was a genuine belief among many reformers that the existing electoral system was fundamentally unjust.
Right.
They pointed to the blatant inequalities that we've already talked about. The rotten boroughs, the lack of representation for these industrial cities, the exclusion of huge segments of the population from the political process, they were making a really strong case for change.
Yeah. So it's like a pragmatic argument and a moral argument.
Exactly.
Like, hey, this system is broken, it's unfair, it's creating instability. We need to fix it.
Right.
Not only for the good of the country, but just because it's the right thing to do.
Absolutely. And their arguments really resonated with a growing segment of the population, particularly among this rising middle class, who were gaining economic power, but they lacked any real political influence.
Right.
They saw the Reform Act as a chance to really secure their place in this evolving political landscape.
Yeah, it's such an interesting moment, right,
Mm,
where you have this shift from the society that was dominated by the landed elite
right.
to all these new groups vying for power.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. So what about the other side?
Yeah.
What about the people who were opposed to the act? Were there any really compelling arguments against this reform?
Oh, absolutely. Not everyone was convinced that change was necessary, let alone desirable.
Yeah.
You had this very powerful conservative faction that viewed the Reform Act as this dangerous experiment, this slippery slope toward anarchy and the erosion of traditional values. They really feared that by expanding the franchise, it would give too much power to the masses, lead to mob rule, the demise of British institutions as they knew it.
Right. So it's like that classic fear of the unknown, right?
Exactly.
Any change, even if it's well-intentioned, could have all these unforeseen consequences.
Yeah, it's a tension that we still grapple with today.
Absolutely, we do. So did those who were opposed to the Reform Act, did they offer any other solutions?
Hmm.
How to address some of this social and political unrest? Or were they simply advocating to keep things the same?
While some conservatives argued for more gradual reforms, perhaps expanding the franchise incrementally, or making these small adjustments to the electoral system, others believed that the existing system, despite its flaws, was the best way to ensure stability and prevent this radical upheaval.
Okay.
They argued that Britain's very long history of parliamentary rule was a testament to its effectiveness, and
Yeah.
that tampering with it was really a risky proposition.
So it wasn't just this completely black and white, us versus them situation.
No, not at all.
There were lots of shades of opinion,
Yeah.
different approaches on how to address the challenges that Britain was facing at the time.
Right.
But ultimately, the reformers won out.
They did.
The 1832 Reform Act became law. It was this huge turning point in British history. Why do you think the reformers were ultimately successful in getting this act passed?
Well, I think a few factors contributed to their success. Firstly, the fear of revolution was very real and present.
Right.
The memory of the French Revolution was still fresh in everybody's minds,
Mm-hmm.
and the British government was very much aware of the potential for unrest at home. Secondly, the reformers were able to really tap into this growing sense of injustice and frustration among a large portion of the population.
Yeah.
The inequalities of the existing electoral system were becoming increasingly difficult to just sweep under the rug.
Yeah, they couldn't just ignore it.
Exactly. And the reformers really skillfully articulated those grievances and made a very compelling case for change.
So they were able to really connect the dots, right?
Yeah.
Between the problems with the system and the bigger social and political anxieties of the time.
Exactly. And thirdly, the reformers themselves were quite a diverse group representing different political factions, social interests. This really broad coalition allowed them to build a wider base of support for the act.
Okay.
So even if their motivations are sometimes quite different, they were able to present this kind of united front.
Yeah. It shows how they were able to find that common ground, right?
Yeah.
Build these alliances and really leverage their influence to try to achieve this shared goal. And speaking of shared goals, we keep talking about this phrase, right? Reform that you may conserve.
Right.
That seems to really get to the heart of this, this idea of this delicate balancing act.
Right.
That sometimes you got to make changes to preserve what you value most. So can you talk a little bit more about this phrase? How does this reflect the political climate of the time?
Well, Macaulay's phrase, it was more than just this clever turn of phrase. It was a really powerful articulation of the reformers' core strategy.
Mm.
They understood that simply clinging to the old order was just not going to work.
Right.
The world was changing. Britain's political system needed to adapt if it was going to survive.
Right.
But they also believed that change could be managed, that it didn't have to mean this complete overthrow of these existing institutions. They really thought to reform the system from within to make it more responsive to the needs of the people,
Right.
while also preserving the essential elements of British parliamentary democracy.
So it's a gamble in some ways, trying to appease the people who are demanding change, but without alienating the people who are clinging to these old traditions.
Absolutely. It was walking this very delicate tightrope. And the success of the 1832 Reform Act is really a testament to the reformers' political savvy.
Yeah.
They understood that change had to be framed in a way that addressed the anxieties of those who feared revolution while also offering a vision of a more just and equitable society.
So it's not just about the specific pieces of the act, it's about the story behind it, right? The
Yeah.
way that it was presented to the public and to the people in power.
Exactly. The reformers, they were masters of rhetoric. They were masters of persuasion.
Yeah.
They appealed to both reason and emotion,
Right.
arguing that reform was not only necessary, but also in the best interests of the nation.
Uh-huh.
They painted this picture of a stronger, more united Britain,
Right.
one where these divisions between the governed and the governors were narrowed,
Okay.
and where the principles of fairness and representation were more fully realized.
So we're seeing how this tension between tradition and progress, between stability and change, really played out in this really important moment in British history.
Absolutely.
The 1832 Reform Act, a landmark achievement.
Right.
But it's really just the beginning of this long and complex process of democratization.
Right.
So let's continue our deep dive and explore the Act's legacy, some of its limitations, and this ongoing struggle for a truly representative government that really continues to unfold in the decades to come.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we've really gotten to explore the context, all the different players, all the different motivations behind the 1832 Reform Act.
It's a really compelling story.
It is. It's a story of compromise and how they navigated a society that was really right on the edge of some major changes.
Absolutely.
But as we know, history isn't just a snapshot in time, it's constantly evolving. So where does this 1832 Reform Act fit into that bigger picture?
Well, I think the Act's real significance lies as much in its symbolism as it does in the concrete changes that it made.
Okay.
It was a sign, however hesitant, that the old system was just not working anymore.
Right.
It opened the door, even if just a crack, to much wider political participation.
So it's like planting these seeds for more reforms down the road, even if it didn't create this perfect democracy overnight.
Exactly. And those seeds, they took time to sprout.
Yeah.
The Act's limitations became clear pretty quickly.
Right.
Working-class men, even with their growing numbers and economic importance, they were still largely disenfranchised.
Right.
And the exclusion of women from voting, as we talked about before, was a huge setback for people who had hoped for a more inclusive reform.
It's kind of a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line forward, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes we take a step back.
Absolutely. But even with those limitations, the 1832 Reform Act really started this chain of events that ultimately did lead to a more democratic Britain. It set this precedent for expanding voting rights, and it gave courage to those who wanted to keep pushing for greater political equality.
So it's like this ripple effect. The act itself might have had a limited immediate impact,
Right.
but it kind of started these waves that spread outward and influenced politics and social movements for decades to come.
Absolutely. And it's really impossible to understand those later reforms, like the Acts of 1867 and 1884 and 1885,
Right.
which further expanded suffrage without recognizing how important that foundation was that was laid by the 1832 Act. It shifted the political landscape, it changed people's expectations, and it made this idea of a truly representative government seem less like a pipe dream and more like something they could actually achieve.
So if we zoom out a little bit, look at the 1832 Reform Act from this, like big picture historical view, how would you sum up its legacy?
Well, it's a complex legacy, for sure, marked by both the progress that was made and the limitations that remained.
Yeah.
It was very much a product of its time. It reflected the anxieties and the hopes of a society that was going through some really rapid change.
Right.
It was a compromise, a balancing act between holding on to tradition and making progress.
Right.
But it was also a crucial turning point in how British democracy developed, a step, even if a little bit hesitant, towards a system of government that was more inclusive and more representative.
It's such a great case study. It shows us how political change happens, how these systems evolve, how societies deal with these periods of upheaval and change. And it reminds us that history isn't always this neat and tidy story. It can be messy and full of contradictions.
Absolutely.
And that progress, while it's definitely hard-won, it rarely happens all at once. It usually comes through these smaller steps, each one building on what came before it.
As we wrap up our deep dive today into the 1832 Reform Act, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. If you could travel back in time and just be a fly on the wall during these debates about this act, whose perspective would you be most interested in hearing? Would it be a member of the landed gentry who's really fiercely defending his traditional privileges, a middle-class factory owner who's excited to have more say in political matters, or maybe a working-class woman who is completely shut out of the political process but still really keenly aware of the system's injustices? whose voice kind of lost to history would you want to amplify?
Wow, that is a powerful question. And it really challenges us to look beyond the official records, beyond what the people in power were saying, and try to see things from the perspective of the people whose lives were most affected by this act, for better or worse. It reminds us that history isn't just about the big events, the battles, the laws, but about all these countless individual stories that make up the human experience. It's been fantastic exploring this really interesting chapter of British history with you today.
Likewise, the pleasure was all mine.
And until next time, keep those minds curious and keep those questions coming.